been a lot of talk about UF strategy and who they've landed in the portal so far this spring cycle. We brought Graham Hall of Swamp 24/7 on to talk about it, so let's jump right into it. Graham, a lot has been made about UF's portal strategy. Some folks hate it. Some folks have, defended it. Can you speak to UF's strategy in the portal and whether or not you think that it's been effective?
That last question is, I think, hard for me to evaluate right now. I think that first I got to say it. You got to give, in my opinion, Billy Napier and his coaching staff the benefit of the doubt, based already even I think what they've done at Florida. Most of the additions that they've made via the transfer portal have impressed me thus far, even if I was, I think, a little bit off on them, not as impressed with them at the time. I mentioned Cam Jackson, Caleb Banks. You go back to Montrell Johnson, Osiris Torrance, Ricky Pearsall. I mean, those are some of the promising or most promising pieces at the time that Florida had added. So when Florida has landed guys, they have hit. And I think that we maybe get too caught up in missing out and that we lose sight of that. And yes, Florida's approach, the I think a little bit patient approach, maybe bothers some people and is going to cause people to miss out on prospects. But I think this is the thing that I really don't understand is why so many people are surprised by Florida's portal strategy being this. Go back to when Billy Napier arrived in November of 2021. The first thing he said in that early signing window was that we are going to have a patient approach. Mm-hmm. We weren't going to rush to sign anyone by the early window. It was absolutely in direct conflict with what Dan Mullen did, where he went out and at the time he recruited very, very hard while setting up his staff, and he stole Emory Jones away from Nick Saban. At the time, he was heralded for that approach. That move looks less impressive in retrospect than the additions in my mind that Billy Napier has made. And again, not to compare apples to oranges, but it just, I think, speaks to the context of things. If you're going to get, I think, wrapped up in thinking that the best result is landing someone that everyone else wants, maybe you need to take a little bit more patient approach. And I hate to say trust the process like I'm a Philadelphia 76ers fan, but maybe you need to, I think, look at the track record of your head coach and their coaching staff, who they've added, who they're targeting, what your needs are as well, and maybe take a deep breath. And if you're really, I think, worked up that a coach who came in here 18 months ago is still taking that patient approach where they're evaluating on-field film and doing a ton of visits and asking prospects to send in film and wanting to evaluate and check every box, if you're really still surprised by that, I hate to say maybe you haven't been following as closely as you think you have, because that has been the MO for Billy Napier and his coaching staff since they've got here. I'm not saying they do that with every prospect, but they are careful and thorough, and sometimes they'd rather be patient and correct than rush into a decision that they're unsure of. And again, that's not to vouch for them and say that that strategy is correct. I just know that that is their strategy. So when I see people upset that they're doing things that we've seen them do time and time again, it's kind of like insanity to me. It's like we're getting worked up over nothing. I think that that's kind of just what it comes down to me. Do I think that maybe Florida has miscalculated some moves and missed out on some prospects in the last month? Absolutely. But am I surprised that they have taken the strategy? No.
Well, I mean, Billy Napier has told us who he was going to be. He's shown us who he was going to be, and I don't think we should be surprised. And Florida only has a handful of scholarships available, and I think the point truly of the portal is for somebody to come in and make an impact immediately, which means not only fit into what you're doing on the field, but fit in with your program culturally, which I think we've seen teams and, maybe even Florida teams of the past take guys in the portal or through transfer that didn't work out because maybe they weren't a culture fit. So you can't knock him for making sure that they will be an improvement in your locker room as opposed to, add an issue or problem. But, they have picked up some guys here in the spring. Let's talk about the most recent addition, Lindell Hudson. Originally was with FIU and then committed to USF, but it seems like UF just kind of swooped right in and got him. Thoughts there?
Yeah, an impressive run blocker. I had said that the offensive line was going to be one that they maybe would address with one of those 2-3 spots remaining. Again, you go back to Micah Mazuka. A guy I didn't mention earlier who suffered an injury is Cameron Waits, another guard,
Yeah.
6'8" guy who suffered a torn Achilles tendon. Knowing that injury, I don't think he's going to have a Cam Akers like return to the field, likely out in my mind for the majority, if not all, of the season. So that's two guards that you're unsure of right now. And then you bring in a guy who maybe has some positional flexibility. You're high on some of your other young offensive linemen, just gives you some additional depth, I think, at that position. And that makes, I think, a lot more sense to me, not to, again, compare, but Florida had recently hosted a running back in Alton McCaskill. He committed earlier to Colorado. I think using a scholarship spot on an offensive lineman is much more wise than taking a running back, knowing what Florida has in the backfield. And again, if kind of go back to the previous point, if Florida had tried to push for a commitment for McCaskill and taken a fifth running back on scholarship, maybe they miss out on an offensive lineman. Who knows? But I think that when you look at whether it's more valuable for them to add an offensive lineman or a running back, easy in my mind to say offensive lineman.
All right, give me your thoughts on R.J. Moten. He's the safety from Michigan. Is he a potential starter for UF?
Yes, I think absolutely. And that's not a knock on who Florida has at safety, because you go back to last year, Kamari Wilson looked really, really good when he rotated in. I think played more than 400 snaps last season. And then you look at Miguel Mitchell. That guy looked really, really good and was able to find playing time in a unit that had two starters in Trey Dean and Rashad Torrance, who had been there starting at safety for the past 2 years. And so you saw those guys see the field early. Unfortunately, both of those guys dealt with minor injuries in spring camp. They also brought some other players into that room. Jamarcus Weston, a former wide receiver, moved to safety. I think that is just one where depth was a big concern. It's, like I said, not a knock on the young guys. You want the two young guys to absolutely just step in there. But you get a guy in R.J. Moten who looked good last year with Michigan. His dad played with the Gators back in the 80s. I remarked that when his dad, moved him in here probably, 6 days ago or whatever it was, that he looked around and saw where he was living, and he probably was extremely jealous because he probably didn't have AC or windows that opened or anything like that. Probably stayed on a small twin bed back when he was in college. Yeah, Jan Hall, exactly. So I think that, a great get for Florida, getting a legacy like that and a guy who could potentially start this season at either one of the safety spots. But I think really the biggest thing is that it provides some reassurance and some quality depth at the spot.
All right, you have had some other guys who have visited and some who have been rumored, but where are other positions UF could use the help in the portal before the season begins here?
Yeah, everyone always talks about quarterback, and you look out there at some of the players still out there. I don't think it's worth adding a quarterback to the room in my mind. I think wide receiver is one to monitor. I know that people were kicking around names like, Keon Coleman, Montana Lamonius Craig. There's other guys out there that, may be worth targeting, but I think that my gut tells me maybe they go the JUCO route with a wide receiver. It's a very similar thing to what they did last year. You go back, they added Ty Chakiel Bowman. I think that name flew under the radar because Ricky Pearsall got all, the headlines, but that guy actually saw the field a lot more than some of the other wide receivers like Trent Whittemore, Dejon Reynolds, like I mentioned. He proved to be a quality add. So if they can find talent from the JUCO ranks at wide receiver, I think they got to do it. One more has to be tight end in my mind. Like I said, similar thing with safeties. Those 5 underclassmen, they are impressed with the progress they've made, but you lose Keon Zipper, who was your top pass-catching tight end last year. Dante Sanders, like I said, not a great, amazing threat in the pass-catching game, has some ability, of course. You don't necessarily want to put the entire onus on the underclassmen. If they can add a tight end through the transfer portal who is impressive option. I know there's some names out there. Seydou Traore was one who I think a lot of people had kicked around. I don't know where he's at in his process. Obviously, you look at the field right now, you kind of have to dig deep and look at some of the options out there because there aren't a ton of options right now at those positions, especially tight ends. So Florida's going to take their time when it comes to adding an offensive weapon, I think, because with limited spots and with the amount of options out there, it doesn't really make sense in my mind to maybe rush into anyone. Maybe you wait things out here and see what happens. A graduate transfer could still enter the portal here and be added to your roster. So maybe you want to save one of those final spots to see what happens.
I'm always a fan of saving those final spots for walk-ons too. All right, so you have lost some guys in the portal: Antoine Powell, Xavier Henderson, David Connor. I think UF will be fine with each of those losses, and you think they'll be able to withstand, losing them essentially?
Yeah, that position was, I think, one to monitor for Florida, because you have the Jack linebacker spot moved to edge, and one of the most impressive players on Florida's defense, which somehow we've talked for, 45 minutes now or whatever, and I haven't mentioned Princely Umanmielen, because he was moved from that defensive line room to that outside linebacker spot where he's now being coached by Mike Peterson. And so you had a lot of those guys who worked at Jack linebacker last year now competing with him in that room at edge. And so Antoine Powell Ryland Jr., a guy who started the last 5 games of the season when Brenton Cox was dismissed from the team, maybe had a chance to be the starter, but then Princely Umanmielen comes in, and that's the guy that I think a lot of people are expecting him to have a huge season for the Gators and prove that he is a future NFL defensive end. I think that you move him over there, and that kind of spelled the end for Antoine Powell Ryland, where he now sought a new destination. And then, for a guy like Xavier Henderson, I think that, I don't know if he's named where he's going to go. I think that he's looking for a situation where he has a chance of a feature option. I mentioned earlier the underclassmen that have rose up, the 3 freshmen, Caleb Douglas, and then you have Ricky Pearsall back, Ty Chalkiel Bowman still competing for snaps as well. So you look at that room, and then a Florida offense that is expected maybe to not throw the ball as much as they did last season. He's looking for, I think, a better chance to showcase what he can do, his improvement, than what Florida's offense is geared towards around right now. Again, no indictments whatsoever. Sometimes these are just a best fit for both parties type situation, and I think that's the case with Powell and a guy like Henderson.
All right, well, thanks for coming on, Graham. We really appreciate it. Can you tell everyone where they can follow you, find your work, and keep up with what you've got going on?
Yeah, hey, I really appreciate y'all having me back. You, again, have to bring me back at the end of the season, please, so I can be held over the fire and you can toast me again. Double Crow, no slaw. You can read me at Swamp247. Follow me on Twitter at GrahamHall_. And if you want to listen to our podcast, hear all of my hot takes about Florida's quarterbacks and who they're going to face this season, you can listen to us on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. That's the Swamp247 podcast. And again, looking forward to being back next time and talk everything with you guys.
All right. Sounds like a plan. Thanks to Graham Hall from Swamp247 for coming on and chatting tonight. We spoke with him about expectations for the 2023 season and why Jordan Travis is not one of the top 5 quarterbacks UF will face in 2023. If you missed either of those, you can click on the screen right now to watch them.